Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we're tackling a thesis that is not just controversial, but which argues for a fundamental, almost unbelievable, reevaluation of Western history since the 1960s.
It's a massive claim.
A massive claim, proposing that one single deeply personal sociological factor accounts for a devastating proportion of, well, observable societal failure. The sources we were given dive deep into social science, theology, generational analysis, even evolutionary biology to back this up.
That's right. And the core research question that these sources pose is very precise and incredibly provocative.
Yeah.
To what degree can the widespread catastrophic failures in Western society?
And we're talking about everything here.
Everything. Family disintegration, demographic collapse, moral degradation, educational dysfunction, and then, the mental illness epidemics that follow. To what degree can all of that be attributed specifically to the ideological corruption of elder women?
Meaning grandmothers.
Specifically grandmothers.
Yeah. We've got two main source documents guiding this exploration. First, there's a philosophical text that synthesizes the theory of cognitive collapse. It argues this collapse is rooted in linguistic corruption and state-enforced moral inversion. It's dense stuff.
It is, but it's critical for understand the psychological pathways that the sources lay out.
Then the second one is a huge sociological white paper. And this one examines the historical role of the grandmother as a civilizational pillar, and it charts its precise breakdown since, really, the cultural shifts started around 1960.
So our mission here is to unpack the evidence these sources are providing, look rigorously at the causal mechanisms of change they propose, and examine the quantitative and the counterfactual data they use to argue that this one single factor accounts for a significant portion.
What's the number they put on it?
They estimate, conservatively, between 35% and 50% of observable societal decline.
Wow. That's almost half.
It's a profound and, frankly, a heavy idea about the immense, often unseen power of intergenerational wisdom and why its failure matters so immediately to the health of our culture and, to you personally.
Okay, let's unpack this, because a claim that large, you have to start at the absolute baseline. You have to understand what was supposedly functioning correctly before the collapse began. So the sources, they establish what they call a historical baseline for the grandmother function. And they argue this role wasn't just some quaint tradition.
No, not all.
It was a universally recognized and, they say, essential civilizational pillar before 1960. They root this necessity in both biological imperative and theological mandate.
Correct. The analysis really starts by stripping away any cultural nostalgia. It tries to demonstrate that the grandmother's presence is actually fundamental to human flourishing, and it confirms its importance across all sorts of diverse historical populations.
Okay, let's start with the biology then, because that gives the evolutionary justification for why she's so necessary.
Absolutely. The sources draw very heavily on what's known as the grandmother hypothesis from evolutionary anthropology. It was pioneered by researchers like Kristen Hawkes.
Right.
And the key observation is that human females are unique. They are among the very, very few mammals that have an extended post-reproductive lifespan. They live for decades past menopause. The question is, why?
And the theory argues that this longevity, it isn't just a byproduct of modern medicine or something. It's an evolutionary adaptation.
Precisely. This long postmenopausal life evolved specifically because grandmother care significantly increases offspring survival rates. It also allows her daughters to have more children, with shorter spacing between them.
Okay, so you can see how that would work in a practical sense.
Well, think about it. A young mother in a subsistence economy, she might have 4 children under the age of 7. It's literally impossible for her to simultaneously forage, cook, teach, and protect them all without just collapsing.
So the grandmother becomes the knowledge transmitter.
Exactly that. She steps in as the repository of intergenerational knowledge. She's teaching foraging techniques, food preservation, herbal medicine, all these efficient survival skills. She basically becomes the essential logistical support system for the entire family unit.
And that support, it isn't just helpful, it directly impacts the survival rates.
It drastically improves reproductive success across 3 generations. It makes her not just helpful, but an evolutionary must-have for large-brained human populations like ours.
And this biological necessity, it's backed up with some specific data, isn't it?
It is. The white paper cites these meta-analyses, like the ones from Sear and Mace, who looked at 45 different studies across diverse populations all over the globe.
And the conclusion?
The conclusion is that the maternal grandmother's presence most strongly correlates with child survival. It's a profound biological finding. It suggests that traditional grandmother is not culturally optional. She is a fundamental evolutionary necessity for human populations to thrive across generations.
So if that's the biological need, the sources then establish a theological foundation, specifically within the Christian tradition. They argue this role is divinely mandated, and this provides the content for that intergenerational transmission.
Right, so the biology explains the why of her long life, and the theology, according to these sources, explains what she's supposed to do with it.
Okay.
They focus very heavily on the instruction in Titus 2.3 to 5. This scripture acts as the traditional mandate for elder women, for the grandmothers. It instructs them to teach what is good, and crucially, to train younger women specifically to love their husbands and children.
It's really specific.
Very specific, to be sensible, chaste, domestic, kind, and submissive.
And the text gives a reason for this, right? It says that the word of God may not be discredited.
Exactly. It's an extremely specific purpose. This passage establishes that the function is intergenerational, the content is practical and domestic, and the purpose is nothing less than essential for the preservation and credibility of the faith itself.
So the argument is, when the family structure functions this way, the faith is honored. When it fails, the faith is discredited.
That's the core of the theological argument, yes.
Okay, but I have to step in here and, provide some critical distance for you, the listener. The sources are using this one specific religious text, Titus 2, as a kind of universal framework for the grandmother's function across the entire Western world before 1960.
Mm-hmm.
How do they justify using a religious text to establish a baseline that applies even to secular or non-Christian families in the West?
That's a really necessary challenge to the thesis. And the sources, they address this by arguing that even the non-religious or, post-Christian Western societies, they still maintain these functional outcomes.
Low divorce, high fertility.
Exactly. Low divorce, high fertility, social capital. Because the cultural scripts that were derived from this theological foundation were still completely dominant. They were in the public square, in the law, in social expectations.
So the culture mold was still Christian, even if the family wasn't.
In short, yes. The non-religious grandmother still advised her granddaughter to marry well and, crucially, to stay married, because those were the cultural norms shaped by that religious mandate. It was just in the water.
That distinction is key. And that mandate, it established what the sources call 4 specific pillars of wisdom that the traditional grandmother was expected to transmit. This really shows the breadth of her influence.
These pillars, they cover every single domain required for continuity. Let's start with Pillar 1, moral and spiritual formation. The sources call her the catechist.
She was the indispensable moral compass.
Yes, she was the primary transmitter of faith in the home. And this involved teaching daily prayers, rosary beads, bedtime prayers, and conveying essential moral education through Bible stories about saints. And crucially, she framed all behavior within an eternal perspective.
Accountability, heaven, hell.
Right. This provided what the sources call the indispensable moral gyroscope for children. It stabilized their self-perception against, fleeting cultural trends.
And this pillar is backed up by one of the most powerful quantitative data points in the entire white paper. It really seems to confirm her centrality to faith transmission.
They cite this monumental Xkbcn et al. 40-year longitudinal study on families and faith. The finding is, frankly, conclusive and startling.
Which is?
The grandmother's religiosity is the single strongest predictor of her grandchild's future religiosity. It actually surpasses the influence of the immediate parents.
So she is statistically more important than the mother or the father in ensuring faith retention. What are the specific numbers on that?
When the grandmother is highly religious and committed, 63% of her grandchildren remain religious into adulthood. But when she is non-religious, faith transmission effectively fails. It drops to a mere 7% of her grandchildren becoming religious.
That swing from 63% success down to 7% failure is just staggering.
It's massive.
What are the broader societal implications of that loss? I mean, what happens when that transmission just stops?
This is where the sources link the spiritual collapse directly to the social failure. The difference between 63% and 7%. It's not just the difference between a Christian and an apostate culture. According to this paper, it's the collapse of a shared moral language.
A shared foundation.
Exactly. When grandmothers stop transmitting faith, society loses its shared foundation for ethics, for justice, for social trust. And the sources argue this creates the vacuum that leads directly to the subsequent decline in social capital, civic participation, and the moral coherence that we see collapsing today. The spiritual engine stalls, and the rest of the machinery just fails shortly after.
Okay, let's move to pillar 2. Practical wisdom transmission, the domestic arts. This is about, well, physical survival and household resilience.
Right. This pillar involved teaching essential survival skills, things that are necessary for a resilient, thrifty, and healthy household. We're talking about food preservation.
Canning, pickling.
Canning, pickling, making use of every single resource, household budgeting, sewing, mending, using folk remedies. This knowledge was a shield. It protected the family against economic shocks. It made the woman economically competent inside the home, which was critical to the old marriage contract.
And the source material contrasts this lost skill set with modern competency levels. They cite the decline in home cooking time.
It's a shocking decline. They cite Pew Research data that shows the average time spent cooking per day in the U.S. dropped from 113 minutes in 1965 to just 37 minutes by 2015.
So more than an hour gone.
A two-thirds drop. That's a direct, measurable decline in the successful transmission of this pillar. And when young women no longer receive this instruction, the consequence isn't just, more takeout and poor budgeting. It's a dependence on external systems and processed foods that leads directly to health and competency problems.
Okay, pillar 3, relationship and marriage wisdom, the counselor. This pillar was about guiding the entire emotional and structural family unit.
This wisdom was highly pragmatic and very long-term oriented. It started with counsel on mate selection.
Right.
The advice focused relentlessly on character, on provision, and on stability over, ephemeral attraction. The maxims are really specific. Watch how he treats his mother. Physical attraction fades. Character remains. Or the critical one, don't marry potential. Marry reality.
That's a big one.
It is. This advice was designed specifically to secure long-term stability for the woman and for her children.
And then the counsel on marriage maintenance was all about modeling perseverance.
Exactly. The advice focused on endurance, modeling conflict resolution, advising the daughter to never threaten divorce, emphasizing that all marriages have difficult seasons, and just constantly modeling loyalty. The analysis emphasizes that the grandmother's own marital stability wasn't just an example. It was a statistically proven protective factor. It predicted her granddaughter's stability through both her modeling and her authoritative experienced advice.
Okay, finally, we get to pillar 4. Social enforcement and gatekeeping, the guardian. This sounds like the least fun pillar. It involves some pretty strict cultural calibration.
It was probably the least fun, but the sources argue it was the necessary mechanism for communal health. Grandmothers served as guardians of the family reputation. They enforced modesty, chastity, and they provided mate selection gatekeeping.
So they had veto power.
They had veto power. They had the authority to approve or disapprove of suitors based on reputation and character. They were the moral police, not because they were mean, but because the stability of the entire family line was considered the highest social good.
Why was that gatekeeping function considered so critical?
Well, the sources, they cite evolutionary psychologists like Miller and Dutton, and they argue that this function was critical because human sexual selection, if it's left unchecked, is naturally hypergamous. It tends toward traits that are, and this is a quote, individually attractive but collectively civilizationally suicidal.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that women, left to their own devices, might naturally select for traits like status, power, or raw physical attraction. Traits that are often detrimental to long-term communal stability if that selection isn't calibrated by elder wisdom that prioritizes commitment, character, and, good fatherhood.
So the traditional grandmother was the essential brake on that innate drive.
She was the calibrator, the brake.
Exactly. Okay, so to summarize part 1, the traditional grandmother was a biological, theological, and sociological necessity. She was the essential moral, practical, and relational link holding society together. And the sources established the 1950s as the final functional period for this model.
Right, characterized by high fertility. The total fertility rate, or TFR, peaked at 3.7.
Almost 4 children per woman.
Almost 4. And very low divorce, around 2.5 per 1,000 marriages. That functional structure was, according to these sources, about to be obliterated.
And very, very rapidly.
Incredibly fast. The stability of the 1950s, it was systematically dismantled by 3 major catalysts in a really short 20-year period between 1960 and 1980. These were seismic shocks that specifically targeted and undermined those pillars of wisdom we just talked about.
Okay, walk us through the 3 primary catalysts that allowed for this ideological capture to happen, starting with technology.
Catalyst 1.
The phone.
Approved by the FDA in 1960, this was a technological event of really unprecedented significance because for the first time, it separated sexual activity from procreation with high reliability and ease.
It was the enabler.
The source is cited as the primary enabler of the sexual revolution. By disconnecting sex from its natural consequence, it made the traditional pillar 4, the gatekeeping and chastity pillar, functionally irrelevant in the eyes of the young generation.
So the technology created the possibility, but it was the ideology that provided the moral justification to reject the old ways. That's what allowed the rejection of Pillar 3, the relational wisdom.
And that was Catalyst 2, the feminist revolution. Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, really served as the ideological manifesto for this.
Right.
It explicitly reframed traditional domestic roles, the entire practical wisdom pillar, Pillar 2, as a form of oppression. She equated homemaking with a comfortable concentration camp.
That's a powerful phrase.
A very powerful phrase. The argument mandated that true fulfillment was found primarily in careers, in public achievement and self-actualization, not in the home or in family life.
And the quote that defines this whole inversion is just so stark. I want something more than my husband and my children and my home. That is the sound of the Titus II mandate being consciously and publicly rejected.
And that rejection, it needed legal teeth to enforce the consequences. And that was Catalyst 3, no-fault divorce laws, which spread like wildfire across the U.S. starting in the late 1960s. This legal shift was absolutely critical.
Why?
Because it transformed marriage from a covenant meant to endure into a private, dissolvable contract.
So how did that legal change undermine the grandmother's advice to persevere?
It fundamentally altered the economic and social incentives for women within a marriage. By making dissolution easy and legally predictable, it made prioritizing a career a rational economic hedge against what seemed like inevitable dissolution. It directly fueled the prioritization shift that the feminists were championing.
And the divorce rates?
They quintupled.
Yeah.
Just shattered the stability that the grandmothers had modeled for centuries.
So we've got the pill weakening moral limits, feminism redefining the role of women, and no-fault divorce eliminating the stickiness of the marriage contract itself. This new environment, it just captured the generation that would become the modern grandmothers, the baby boomers.
And this created what the sources call the generational shift. The baby boomer generation coming of age during this revolutionary period, they often actively rejected the hard-earned wisdom of their silent generation mothers.
They just saw it as old-fashioned.
Worse than old-fashioned. They saw it as the architecture of their own oppression. The white paper estimates that up to 85% of women in this cohort were ideologically captured to some degree by these inverted values.
And this ideology didn't just stay on college campuses. The sources document its consolidation and institutional capture throughout the 1970s.
Exactly. The ideology achieved dominance in every single institution. Education, with women's studies programs, law, with Roe v. Wade in 1973 serving as the final moral catalyst for many, psychology, with therapeutic models that often encourage divorce, and, of course, the media.
So by the time these captured boomer women began having their own children and then their grandchildren, the entire institutional scaffolding supported the new inverted system of values.
It made it nearly impossible for the small remaining pockets of traditional wisdom to survive. The culture was just saturated with it.
The result is what the sources call the complete inversion of values. The source material has this functional table that illustrates the stark contrast in advice. And the key takeaway, as the white paper argues, is that the traditional wisdom didn't just fade away.
No.
It was replaced by active opposing inverted values.
Look at the direct substitution. Where the traditional grandmother valued lifelong commitment as the highest good, the captured grandmother values individual happiness and self-focus. Where traditional advice was pragmatic, persevere in marriage because it's hard, the modern advice became therapeutic and radical. Leave if you're unhappy, you deserve better.
This isn't passive failure. This is active misdirection.
Yeah, it's active misdirection. And where the traditional grandmother taught domestic competence as foundational, the new grandmother modeled career first. The moral standard of chastity and modesty was explicitly discarded for sexual exploration, you do you, which was often celebrated as a badge of freedom.
The white paper emphasizes that this replacement by inverted values is what makes the collapse so rapid and so destructive.
Right. When a transmission mechanism just breaks, the information is gone. But when it starts transmitting the opposite of stability, it actively accelerates dysfunction.
And the white paper presents a really powerful mathematical model to illustrate this speed of decay. Can you explain why a 70% efficiency loss per generation leads to such a rapid extinction of wisdom?
Well, if you model traditional wisdom as a body of knowledge, let's call it T, that gets transmitted, and the next generation only adopts 30% of it. So Tn plus 1 equals Tn times zero point 0.3. You see an immediate exponential decay.
Okay.
After just one generation, 70% of the wisdom is gone. After 2 generations, 91% is gone. By the time the 4th generation arrives, less than 1% of the original wisdom is retained.
In that timeline, 4 to 5 generations from 1960 to the 2020s, it perfectly matches.
It matches. It shows why the moral, practical, and spiritual wisdom that was established in the 1950s is functionally extinct today. The grandmothers, according to this argument, became the engine of cultural amnesia, accelerating the decay exponentially.
Okay, this brings us to the absolute core of the argument, causation. How does a grandmother's change in her personal values actually translate into a measurable civilizational breakdown? The sources integrate the theological perspective from a writer named Stephen Work with a psychological one from John Carter to identify several powerful causal mechanisms, starting with moral corruption.
We have to start with Stephen Work's theological apologetic. He argues that the state-enforced acceptance of abortion was what he calls the original wound.
The original wound.
Yes, and he frames this not as a political or legal event, but as a deep spiritual trauma that was inflicted upon the collective soul of society.
He calls it the original wound of insanity acceptance. What does that term really signify?
Work posits that the societal normalization of abortion, particularly after Roe v. Wade in 1973, it compelled society to assent to a foundational, objective, moral falsehood. The termination of a developing human being had to be accepted as normal or even good.
So a forced cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. This official inversion of life and death, he argues, initiated a profound psychological and spiritual collapse of abstract reason.
And this wound created the perfect host environment for what John Carter calls the woke mind virus in his theory of linguistic corruption and homo umbrans.
Precisely. Carter's theory synthesizes with Work's by arguing that this required initial inversion redefining life as a clump of cells, preconditioned the populace to accept all subsequent linguistic and moral inversions.
Okay, so what is homo umbrans?
Carter defines homo umbrans, it literally means the shadow man, as an individual who has lost the capacity for true self-awareness and abstract reason because the moral and semantic language they use has been completely corrupted.
The goal is to define concepts out of existence so you can't even think about them properly.
It can't. The sources argue that in the homo umbrans state, rational discourse is impossible because the words themselves are weapons and they have inverted meanings.
Give us some examples of this linguistic corruption that the sources cite.
For instance, hate becomes the moral judgment on any love or loyalty directed towards one's own family or in-group. Speech becomes violence if it challenges the narrative. Silence becomes violence if it doesn't affirm the narrative. Equity becomes legalized discrimination, and progress becomes active systemic decay,
So the initial lie made all the subsequent lies easier to swallow.
leading to what Carter calls the annihilation of the soul.
This is critical. Now let's connect that back to the grandmothers. How did they become the primary vector for disseminating this moral and linguistic poison down through the family line?
Because they are the primary intergenerational transmitters of values and language, they're the ones who translate the state-sanctioned insanity into family-level advice. Let's look at mechanism 1, mate selection dysfunction, the calibrator failure.
We mentioned this earlier. The grandmother was the necessary check on innate female hypergamy. We should probably be clear about what that term means.
Hypergamy just means the sociological tendency to seek a mate of higher status, resources, or attraction. The sources argued the traditional grandmother was the primary calibrating force on this drive. She taught women to temper raw attraction and look for long-term provision, character, and commitment. That created stability.
And the modern grandmother's failure to do this, or worse, her active miscalibration, leads to mathematically dysfunctional mating patterns.
It creates a supply and demand mismatch that just completely destabilizes society. The white paper cites online dating data, which shows that women collectively rate 80% of men as below average.
80%.
80%. This means the vast majority of women are directing all of their attention to a very small, elite fraction of males. This is extreme hypergamy and results in widespread dissatisfaction for the women and, the withdrawal of large segments of men from the dating and marriage market because they just feel completely excluded.
How does the grandmother actively cause this specific dysfunction? What is she saying?
She's using the inverted values we talked about. The advice, don't settle or you deserve better, translates into prioritizing ephemeral, high-status traits over foundational character and commitment. The white paper estimates that this grandmother failure accounts for a staggering 60% of the observed mate selection dysfunction in the current generation. She actively prevents the formation of stable unions.
That's an immense claim. How do the sources account for other factors, like the shift from an industrial to a service economy, when they assign 60% of the blame for dating dysfunction to grandmothers?
That's a necessary question. They argue that economic shifts only provide the opportunity for dysfunction. The grandmother provides the permission and the instruction to act dysfunctionally.
Can you give an example?
Sure, if a man loses his factory job, the traditional grandmother would counsel, "Stay with him. We'll help him find new work. It's a hard time." The modern captured grandmother counsels, "Leave him. He's failed to provide. You deserve better." The resulting choice stability versus dissolution is mediated by the grandmother's counsel, which makes her the primary causal lever in that decision.
Okay, let's move to mechanism 2. Enabling dysfunction through material support. This is where well-intentioned logistical help actually goes wrong.
Right. Traditional grandmothers provided support that was designed to strengthen the marriage, living nearby, providing postpartum care, but always reinforcing the husband's authority and the unity of the family.
And modern grandmothers.
Modern grandmothers often provide support that actively enables breakdown. This includes intensive long-term childcare that enables a daughter to pursue a full-time career immediately after birth, which prioritizes the career over that crucial early bonding time and often undermines the father's primary role.
Or, even more critically, providing support for divorce itself.
Precisely. They provide the logistical and emotional permission structure for divorce. This support is often, "You can move in with me, I will pay for your lawyer," or "I will raise your children while you go find yourself." This material support is often the decisive tipping point for a woman who's contemplating divorce. It removes the fear of economic hardship that might otherwise compel her toward reconciliation.
And the sources claim this enabling support is incredibly potent. They attribute a huge percentage of failed marriages to its presence.
The estimation in the paper is that grandmother opposition, a firm, "No, you must try to work this out for the children's sake," could have prevented between 40 and 75% of divorces.
40 to 75%.
Yes. By tipping the scales toward reconciliation and perseverance instead of separation, the grandmother's voice and logistical power provides both the moral and the logistical permission to fail.
In both of these mechanisms, they converge on mechanism 3. Creating father absence, which they call the single motherhood epidemic. This is the ultimate negative consequence.
The grandmother is identified as a key causal factor in father absence via two primary pathways. First, encouraging promiscuity and sexual exploration, which leads to unwed pregnancy, and second, actively encouraging or enabling divorce. The sources document the devastating long-term effects of father absence on children, educational, behavioral, psychological problems across all demographic groups.
And the statistical attribution of her role in this is one of the most explosive claims in the paper.
By combining her influence on never-married motherhood and on divorce, the analysis concludes that grandmother ideology and behavior account for approximately 49 to 54% of all father absence in modern society.
So half.
Half. This means the corruption of the grandmother function is the primary single largest driver of the negative outcomes associated with father absence, surpassing the welfare state, mass incarceration, or other economic factors.
That's an extraordinary number. Half of all fatherlessness in the West attributed to the grandmother's influence. How do the sources handle the political sensitivity of this claim, especially considering the early welfare laws that disproportionately affected Black communities, which are often cited as the primary cause of father absence?
The analysis argues that the welfare state provided the economic viability for single motherhood in marginalized communities starting in the 1960s. But it was the ideological shift in the general population supported by grandmothers that provided the cultural normalization.
So the grandmother is the vector.
The white paper posits that the dysfunction spread to the general population because the middle and upper-class grandmothers adopted the therapeutic, self-focused ideology and enabled their daughters' choices. They created a universal cultural acceptance of a pattern that was previously confined mostly to the economically distressed. The grandmother is the vector that spread the ideology across all demographic lines. The data points to catastrophic failure across every single domain that relies on stable intergenerational transmission. And the white paper conservatively attributes 35 to 50% of the variance in these trends to the collapse of the grandmother function.
Okay, let's start with the hard numbers. The impact on demographics. specifically the fertility collapse that is threatening the future of Western nations.
The U.S. total fertility rate, the TFR, which is the average number of children a woman has in her lifetime, has just plummeted. It's gone from 3.65 in 1960 to a dangerous 1.62 today.
Which is way below replacement rate.
Far below the replacement rate of 2.1. It's a signal of civilizational decline, and the decline is systematic. It's not random.
So what is the primary causal link that the analysis provides here?
The primary mechanism is the delay of marriage and childbearing, and this results directly from the modern grandmother's inverted advice to prioritize career first, family later. The sources point out that this ideologically driven advice conflicts fundamentally with biological reality. The biological window for childbearing is fixed, but the career window is flexible.
And the outcome of that is regret and childlessness.
Yes. The sources cite data showing a significant increase in involuntary childlessness and profound regret, particularly among highly educated women who followed this feminist ideology transmitted by their grandmothers. They realize, often too late, that the advice directly conflicted with their biological design. The paper estimates that grandmother ideology contributes 45% to the demographic collapse.
So it's not a failure to have children, it's a failure to prioritize them at the appropriate time because of flawed intergenerational counsel.
Precisely.
Okay, next, the impact on family stability. Specifically, the surge in single motherhood, which has risen from about 5% of births out of wedlock in 1960 to over 40% today.
The analysis notes that the combination of the welfare state and the grandmother ideology created this powerful dysfunction trap. The welfare state provides the necessary financial stability for a single mother to survive, but it's the grandmother ideology that provides the necessary emotional, logistical, and moral support to make that choice socially acceptable and personally affirming, despite the known harms to children.
So the grandmother facilitated the cultural spread of the dysfunction.
By providing that affirmation, you go girl, you don't need a man, and by offering free child care and housing, she removed the last remaining social and economic restraints against family dissolution. She normalized single motherhood, ensuring that the next generation would view it not as a tragedy, but as a viable, if difficult, life choice.
Let's turn to the impact on moral formation and mental health, which is arguably the most immediate crisis facing Gen Z right now.
This starts with the collapse of that spiritual pillar. The mass religious disaffiliation, the rise of the nones from 5% in 1970 to nearly 30% today, is a direct consequence of the less religious baby boomer grandmothers replacing the devout silent generation. When that moral foundation is removed, the edifice just collapses.
And instead of transmitting faith and resilience, the modern grandmother transmits something the sources define as emotivism and narcissistic messaging. What is that?
This is the critical moral inversion. She transmits emotivism advice like follow your heart and your feelings are the most important truth. This is coupled with narcissistic messaging. You're special, and a relentless focus on self-esteem.
And this is in direct opposition to traditional resilience.
Completely. Traditional resilience transmitted by grandmothers focus on objective moral duty and endurance. Advice like, life is hard, accept it. You have a duty to others. Or, in the traditional religious context, offer up your suffering.
And the consequence of raising a generation without those traditional stabilizing structures is the current mental illness epidemic in youth.
The data is alarming and really inescapable. The 2021 YRBS data shows 57% of teen girls reporting persistent sadness and hopelessness. This generation, raised in broken families, saturated with self-focused ideology and devoid of the traditional structures of faith and moral order, was just psychologically primed for this massive collapse. The grandmothers, the sources argue, provided the ideological foundation for fragility, not for resilience.
We also have to spend some time on the impact on the gender confusion epidemic, which the sources argue is actively facilitated by a specific type of modern grandmother.
The sources detail the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD, and it's highly specific. It affects mostly adolescent girls, over 70% of clinic referrals, often in friendship clusters, rather than young boys who exhibit classic dysphoria from a young age.
And the grandmother's role here is often that of an affirming grandmother.
Right.
How does the affirming grandmother manifest? What does she do?
She becomes the loudest voice for the ideology within the family. She actively promotes social transition, she uses preferred pronouns immediately, she buys gender-affirming clothing, and, this is critical, she may offer to pay for hormones or surgery if the parents resist or show any hesitancy.
And her affirmation is uniquely powerful.
It is, because she's viewed as the ultimate authority figure who validates the child's subjective feelings over the parent's logical caution.
The argument is that this affirmation accelerates an irreversible path, compounding the tragedy that's caused by the linguistic corruption we discussed earlier.
Precisely. The sources argue this external ideological affirmation accelerates the irreversible medical pathway. It can lead to sterilization and mutilation of grandchildren who are often merely confused or autistic or suffering from underlying trauma rather than being genuinely dysphoric. The critical point is that the traditional grandmother, the guardian from Pillar 4, she would have provided resistance. She would have required time and psychological stability, not ideological affirmation that locks in destructive, life-altering choices based on fleeting feelings.
So we've covered correlations and some very strong statistical attributions, but correlation versus causation is the ultimate question here. Does the evidence truly prove that the ideological corruption of the grandmother is the cause, and not just a symptom of some broader cultural decline?
The white paper argues for causation with a very high confidence level, somewhere between 75 and 85%, and it's largely based on the counterfactual evidence.
Okay.
The argument is simple. If the decline was merely a symptom of modernity or technology or capitalism, then every population exposed to those forces should show the exact same rapid, multifaceted decline. But they demonstrably do not.
This is the power of the counterfactual, comparing the mainstream decline to communities that have successfully preserved the traditional grandmother function.
Exactly. We look at communities that explicitly adhere to the traditional models, often defined by their explicit rejection of the 1960s inversion. And the contrast is just stark. For example, the Amish. They're exposed to modernity, but they reject the ideological and technological catalysts. They have a 90+% retention rate for their children, a TFR of 6 to 7.
6 to 7 children per woman.
Right. A divorce rate of less than 1% and near zero mental illness or crime rates. Why? Their grandmothers maintained the traditional skills, the moral instruction, and rigorous matchmaking supervision. All 4 pillars of wisdom remain intact.
And the same applies to high observance religious groups.
Yes. You look at Orthodox Jews, they show exceptional growth rates, about 4% annually, and a TFR between 4.1 and 6.6. The role of the bubby, the grandmother, is explicit in religious transmission, in managing family logistics, and ensuring early, stable marriage structures.
And traditional Catholic communities as well.
Similarly, the traditional Catholic communities that explicitly adhere to that Titus II model we discussed, they demonstrate profoundly low divorce rates, under 5%, and high fertility, 4 to 6 children.
So the results are clear. These communities are thriving on every single metric where mainstream society is failing. They live within the West, they use electricity and cars, but they reject the ideological framework of the captured grandmothers.
And the conclusion from counterfactuals is that the primary difference is the functioning intergenerational transmission of wisdom, the grandmother function. This provides the most compelling evidence that the loss of that function is causal, not merely correlational. When the transmission is intact, stability and growth follow immediately, regardless of the surrounding cultural chaos.
This raises the final critical question. If this generation of grandmothers broke the chain of continuity and this ideological capture runs so deep, is there a path back? What intervention is even possible?
The sources are highly pessimistic about top-down policy solutions. They argue that the political, the legal, the educational elites are just too fully captured by the inverted ideology.
So the strategy has to be personal.
The strategy offered focuses entirely on spiritual and personal action, starting with the source of the breakdown.
That sounds like a powerful call to repentance.
It requires a radical and probably painful realignment with truth, starting with the grandmothers themselves. This involves acknowledgement and a repentance, confessing specific, concrete moral failures and ideological errors.
The sources emphasize this has to be concrete.
Very concrete. Confessing, I encouraged my daughter to prioritize her career over motherhood. I supported my granddaughter's choice to have an abortion. Or, I put my own self-focus and happiness above the stability of my family. This act, they argue, breaks the spiritual and cultural cycle of lying.
Okay, so once that repentance occurs, the next step is the recovery of traditional wisdom, a conscious, immediate return to the Titus II model.
Exactly. Grandmothers are called to model and transmit the recovered wisdom. This means prioritizing tangible spiritual practices, like a daily rosary or frequent confession, recovering practical skills like cooking from scratch and teaching budgeting and transmitting relational skills, encouraging perseverance in marriage, not radical autonomy. They have to consciously and publicly reject the inverted values they once championed, understanding that their power to teach is immense.
And the sources also emphasize the power of intercessory prayer.
They urge grandmothers to follow the example of St. Monica, who prayed ceaselessly for 17 years for the conversion of her son, St. Augustine. This acknowledges that the struggle is not merely cultural or psychological, but spiritual. Prayer provides the necessary power to accomplish what human words and arguments alone cannot, to break through the cognitive and moral corruption of Homo umbrans.
The most potent act, however, is the modeling of conversion for their daughters and granddaughters.
Yes, the grandmother must explicitly admit her error and model a new, virtuous life trajectory. The white paper concludes with this specific case study of a grandmother who, through firm, loving intervention, actively rejected the cultural script, saved her pregnant granddaughter from a planned abortion, and then facilitated a successful marriage.
So a single elder can save a family line.
It demonstrates the ultimate point of the paper. A single, wise, and converted elder can save an entire family line from collapse. It shows the path back is individual, but the impact is civilizationally profound.
We've traced the thesis that the ideological capture of elder women, specifically grandmothers, is the single largest factor driving societal dysfunction since 1960, accounting for, as you said, up to half of the observed societal variance. That is a massive weight of responsibility placed squarely on one generation and one foundational societal role.
Indeed. The sources argue, I think quite convincingly, that the power of the grandmother to shape civilization is immense and biological in its depth. The choice today is existential, whether they use that power to transmit traditional wisdom and continuity or inverted ideology and destruction. And the counterfactual evidence shows that if we restore that intergenerational teaching role, societal stability returns almost immediately.
This has been a deep dive into an argument that really challenges the core assumptions of modernity, theology, and sociology. And whether you agree with the ultimate conclusions about moral responsibility or not, the granular analysis of the data linking generational values to child outcomes and civilizational health, it's compelling. It demands serious attention.
It really makes you think about your own lineage. Where did your family's intergenerational transmission break down? Or, where did it remain strong? The health of the entire culture, according to this, depends entirely on the wisdom or the lack of it being passed down from the elders to the young women.
Our final provocative thought for you to consider. If the single most destructive force in modern society was the breakdown of the spiritual, moral, and practical formation passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, then what is the single most important specific piece of practical wisdom, a domestic skill, a prayer, a maxim, or moral clarity that you need to recover right now to ensure your own lineage survives the current societal decline?